Hello and welcome to Press Start Australia's late night video game news show. I'm your host, Ewan Roxburgh, and ladies and gentlemen, we need to have a conversation. It's going to be a long one and it's not ending anytime soon, but first, here's the news. On March the 16th, 2017, Outlast 2 was refused classification by the Australian Classification Board, effectively banning the game from sale and distribution here in Australia, much to the disappointment of Outlast fans. It was refused classification in accordance with the National Classification Code Computer Games Table Section 1 subsection A, as it, quote, depicted, expressed, or otherwise dealt with matters of sex, drug misuse or addiction, crime, cruelty, violence, or revolting or abhorrent phenomena in such a way that they offend against the standards of morality, decency, and propriety generally accepted by reasonable adults to the extent that they should not be classified. It has, of course, reignited the debate as to the classification of video games here in Australia, a debate that continues since an R18 plus classification category was introduced in the beginning of 2013. This recent decision has once again cast doubt over the relevance and appropriateness of video game classification and has caused confusion as to the purpose of the R18 classification category. First, let's take a closer look at the specific reason why Outlast 2 was refused classification. Thanks to Kotaku Australia, we now know that the game's refused classification revolves around a particular cutscene which, quite graphically too I might add, implies sexual violence. I don't think it's quite necessary to go into the specifics of the scene or the gory details. There is, of course, the issue of spoilers, I might add, if you're concerned about that, but you can read the full description in our post over at pressstart.com.au. Take my word for it though, it does sound pretty horrific, and does a little bit more than imply sexual violence in my mind. And sexual violence, implied or otherwise, is a big no-no to the ACB. The Australian Classification Board is a statutory body independent of the government that oversees the classification of film, television, video games, and certain other publications here in Australia. In regards to their decisions on video games, sexual violence, either explicit or implicit, and drug use related to incentives warrants a refusal of classification. Games deemed R18+ are simply described as, quote, computer games except refused classification computer games that are unsuitable for viewing or playing by a minor, according to the National Classification Code, Computer Games Table Section 2. Consistency remains an issue. Sexual violence is arguably implied in Crystal Dynamics' Tomb Raider, as well as Naughty Dog's The Last of Us, which received MA15+ and R18+ classifications respectively, although in this case it does seem a lot more obvious. Of course, Outlast 2 isn't the only game to have been refused classification in Australia since the introduction of the R18+ classification. State of Decay was initially refused classification for relating in-game stimulants with benefits, but was later granted an R18+ classification after they renamed the stimulants vitamins, or vitamins, however you pronounce it. South Park: The Stick of Truth was also initially refused classification after the inclusion of the now infamous alien abduction anal probing scene, which was then replaced by a title card and granted access to the Australian market with an R18 classification. Hotline Miami 2 maintains its status as refused classification due to the inclusion of a scene depicting implied sexual violence. The ACB takes a hard line, and it's my concern that Red Barrels, the developers of Outlast 2, are going to do a cost-benefit analysis and deem it not worth their while to edit the game to get past the Australian classification standards. But now we get to the big question, and that is, of course, is this level of regulation really necessary? And to an extent, yes, I think it is. There is some truly horrific content out there, whether it be film, TV, or video games, that I don't think necessarily has a place in Australian society. Let's consider Baby Shaker, a game that was removed from the App Store in 2009 through Apple's own self-regulation. As reported by The Guardian, the game encouraged players to shake their phone to quieten the on-screen baby until red X's appeared over their eyes. Do we really need games like that? Of course, there are valid arguments against overregulation too. Adults ought to have the right to choose what they consume, and the refusal of classification removes this choice. Let's not forget that the classification process is ultimately a subjective process of applying assumed societal standards and expectations to content. Additionally, there is inconsistency in the way that video games are classified compared to film and TV, despite a lack of any conclusive evidence that shows that the interactivity inherent and unique to video games contributes to increased aggression or behavioral tendencies. Perhaps the most convincing argument against regulation, and specifically the refusal of classification, is that in this day and age, it's largely irrelevant. Whilst a customs officer may seize a copy of the game as a prohibited import, it is practically impossible to police a digital exchange online. But what do you think? Do we need regulation, or maybe we just need classification without the refusal of classification? Let us know, hit us up on Twitter or Facebook at pressstartau, or drop a comment at the website over at pressstart.com.au. I've been Ewan. Until next time, happy gaming.